I'm the Sound Tracker, and I'm super psyched for this one because I've got something really special today. Reel-to-reel. Now, this is a format that, for me at least, was always sort of an otherworldly device. It's the kind of thing that only spies got to use for getting the deepest secrets from the highest-ranking people, or corporate espionage, like in Penthouse and Pavement. Point is, I always thought that these were really awesome and mystical things because to get those kinds of recordings, the sound quality would have to be immaculate, and the mechanism would have to have little to no chance of failure. So such a device could only bring the same benefits to music, and that is exactly what I want to talk about today. There are a lot of different types, kinds, and styles of reel-to-reel, from professional to domestic, all of them with neat little quirks and intricacies to how they operate, but the focus for today is going to be domestic. Specifically, the Pioneer RT707. Take a look at this thing and tell me it doesn't belong on a spaceship giving a supercomputer information somehow. I love the design of this thing. I mean, aesthetically, it's a beautiful tape deck, but more importantly, the functions are all really nicely laid out. Starting at the bottom right, we have all the usual controls for a tape player. You've got fast forward, rewind, stop, play, and record. Above that is a pause button and buttons to change the direction of the tape. Yeah, this particular machine is capable of both reverse play and auto-reverse, which for a reel-to-reel is absolutely a great feature. More on that in a bit. In the middle of the deck are two rollers to keep the tape tension, the capstan here to regulate the tape speed, and beneath this plate are the tape heads. Starting from the left, this is a play head and only works in the reverse mode when the tape travels backwards. The rest of the heads only work in the forward mode. This black one is the erase head, which wipes all the previous recordings from a tape to prepare it for recording, if that's what you happen to be doing at the time. The next one in the sequence is the record head itself, which records the sound signal onto a tape. The final head here is another playback head, which plays the tape in the forward direction. On the left, we have knobs for controlling the record input level from microphone and line sources, the left and right channel for each one individually controlled by the thinner or thicker parts of the knob, like so. We also have a stereo headphone jack and mono left and right microphone jacks, all of them 1/4 of an inch in size. Across the center we have the supply reel and the take-up reel spindles, two gorgeous big VU meters, record and pause indicator lights, a pitch control knob which gives a slight variance to the speed of the deck, a counter over here which counts numerologically as the tape is playing, and a repeat button. This is actually one of the more interesting features in my opinion. This deck is capable of endless playback of both sides of a tape, but again, more on that in a bit. Along the top, we have the function controls in a neat line. The power button on the left, the speed selector, which controls the speed of the tape, labeled in centimeters. 19 centimeters is 7.5 inches per second, and 9.5 centimeters is 3 3/4 inches per second. To be clear, there are a couple of other speeds that domestic players are capable of running, but these are the two most common tape speeds for pre-recorded reels, so we aren't really missing much functionally speaking. Next up we have a monitor button, which allows you to switch between hearing the sound source coming into the deck and hearing it as it's being recorded onto the tape. This is one of the reasons why a 3-head, or in this case a 4-head deck, is better to have. You can find out in real time how a recording is going to sound and make adjustments gradually without having to keep rewinding the tape and listening back. More on that in a bit once more. Bias and equalization are also for recording. They control very specific recording characteristics depending on the kind of tape that you're using. You can switch between standard or LH, which stands for low-high. This refers to low noise high output tape, which I'll get into in a little bit after all the other little bits that I've mentioned I'd get into in a bit. The final two buttons apply to the record mode. At the bottom, there's already a record switch next to the play button, but this is a master record switch. It's the difference between yes, I want to record and no, I don't want to record. These buttons control the individual channels themselves, so you can record only on the left channel if you want, or only the right channel if you want, both in mono. The rear of the deck is refreshingly simple. 4 RCA jacks, 2 for line in and 2 for line out, a DIN jack for compatibility with things that take the DIN standard. For some reason there are some hi-fi units from the 70s that have this, and I have no idea why if we were already using the RCA standard in the first place, but whatever, it's on there too. And lastly, 2 potentiometers for output volume control, which I pretty much just leave centered. I know the machine looks complicated and daunting at first, but in all honesty, it's really not. It's just a tape player that has a couple of quirks based on some different standards of the time, and once you use it a couple of times, it really becomes second nature. And speaking of using it, and standards, the standard that it uses is 1/4 inch open reel tape. This means that the tape itself is 1/4 of an inch wide, and in this particular instance is a 4-track, 2-channel system. It records and plays 2 tracks of stereo left and right audio, first in one direction, and then when one side's used. It does the same in the other direction, similar to how cassettes work. Flip the tape over and use the other side. For domestic players, there's 3 separate sizes of reels to conform to different amounts of tape. There's 5-inch reels, 7-inch reels, and 10-inch reels respectively, and this one is my personal favorite. So the bigger the reel, the more tape you have, and thus the more recording time possible. While there are 3 different sizes of reels that take 1/4-inch tape, the 10-inch one I can't actually use with this machine because it's too big. There are other machines that are capable of holding a reel that size, but they typically cost much more money, and I just don't have one right now. They look awesome though, I mean, big beefy behemoths of a reel-to-reel, they're so cool! While I do lust after a big 10-inch machine, I don't want to discount the usability of 5 and 7-inch only machines because these things pack the same kind of sound quality, and while it may be less tape just from the sheer size of it, albums that are pre-recorded are pretty much always on 7-inch tapes, so a 7-inch machine, like the RT-707, is a good starting point. And speaking of the pre-recorded albums, if you look around online, it's gonna be a lot of stuff like this. Classical music, Broadway soundtracks, easy listening, jazz, maybe some things that Grandpa would have been into in his 40s. Now, I do enjoy these kinds of music, otherwise I wouldn't have these tapes, but this is also not usually my first choice of music to put on. I mean, I'm more into progressive rock, new wave, electronic, things like that, and I have to be in a particular mood to listen to these. There are some more contemporary reel-to-reel tapes, like, Chicago, for example, or, Billy Joel and Herb Alpert's Tijuana Brass, but whenever I come across them, they're priced pretty high, so the expense of more contemporary music... essentially this is how I feel about it.
Are they heavy?
Yeah.
Then they're expensive. Put them back.
Yeah, some of them can be pretty expensive, but there are some good deals to be had if you enjoy the kind of music that's offered and want to mess around with the format. So, pre-recorded tapes, from what I've seen, typically come on 7-inch reels and are recorded in one of 2 speeds, 3 3/4 or 7.5 inches per second. The higher the speed, the better the recording will sound, which is why 7.5 inches per second tapes are usually more expensive. Now, that's not to say that 3 3/4 inches per second doesn't sound good, it's just, it doesn't sound quite as good as a 7.5 inches per second tape. This tape is currently playing at 3 3/4 inches per second. It sounds pretty good, nice and warm, clear audio, and you can hear my voice pretty well through it. It's decent, but with it being the slower speed, it holds less magnetic information over time, so the sound quality suffers. This is 7.5 inches per second. It's much cleaner and clearer, you can hear more space in the audio, and this is the main reason that reel-to-reel is such a great format. The sound quality is so incredibly good even at the lesser speed. I mean, just listen to some of the tapes I've got.
Something for everyone at comedy tonight. Something that's gaudy.
That, I can tell you in one word, tradition.
And out of curiosity, how does a tape from the 60s sound against its more traditional counterparts?
Because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many years. Here in Anatevka, we have...
How did this tradition get started?
I'll tell you. I don't know.
Tradition!
Yeah, it sounds great! That recording of Fiddler on the Roof came out in 1964. That's 58 years ago as of this recording, and holds up really well against both a record and a CD, the same way the rest of the tapes that I have do. There's a lot that I appreciate about pre-recorded tapes, but as I said, they're not always the music that I'm in the mood to listen to. Fortunately, these things make great recordings, and that is really what I think is more the appeal of reel-to-reel. Not the pre-recorded tapes, but the ones that you can make yourself. Tape recorders were used for a lot of things, one of which happened to be copying your records over to a tape. This logo got put around a lot because, well, recordable tape can hold a lot of music. This realistic super tape, for example, is 1,800 feet long, so if we take a look at the back, we get a tape running time chart. So let's see here, tape time is in minutes, times are in one direction for mono or stereo. So if we go over here to the tape length section, it's 1800 feet, which means that if I want to record at the best possible speed, which is 7.5 inches per second, that leads us over here to 48 minutes of recording time on one side. So a record, by comparison, is usually about 45 minutes long, so this tape can hold the equivalent of 2 records, one per side, as a best possible scenario. If you're willing to deal with 3 3/4 inches per second, that's 96 minutes, which works out to 4 LPs worth of music on one tape. So basically what I think used to happen was,
Hey, yo, Daryl, borrow some of your records, man. I want to make a tape. Downtown, Mitch, baby, you know I got you. Come on. Tell you what, you take this on home, you have a sample of that, you tell me if you like it, huh? Oh, the new Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Oh, been dying to put this one on the platter. Look at it. Hey, thanks a lot, Daryl, baby. I'll have this back to you after the christening, alright?
and that's more or less how I think most pre-recorded tapes ended up with a ton of albums on them, like this one here. Now, this particular paper came inside of that box, and look at how much music is on this tape. That is a ton. If you're looking to record to a tape, there are a couple of things to look out for, the first of which is the chemical formulation of the tape itself. Now, this isn't always immediately apparent on the boxes, but as time went on, tape formulations changed. Tape is made up of a lot of tiny metal particles, and when a sound source comes into the tape recorder, these particles move past the record head and become magnetized based on the sound that comes in, which means the tape itself holds a magnetic flux of the sound wave. The changes in formulation change certain characteristics of the sound because later tape formulations absorb and imprint magnetic flux more accurately. Earlier formulations like this one are a little bit more brown than others, and while they have a great sound quality for their time, they weren't necessarily as good at holding high-frequency sound on the tape. Later formulations are darker, better at holding higher frequencies, and have a better signal-to-noise ratio, which means you'll have a cleaner, more accurate recording. The color is really the easiest way to identify the kind of tape you're using, and the reason you'll need to do that is, some tape recorders, like the RT707, have bias and EQ adjustments that need to be made depending on the formulation of tape that you're using. The standard setting is for the lighter brown tapes, and the LH setting is for the darker ones. LH is a stand-in for low noise, high output, which essentially means if you're using a darker, low noise, high output formulation, the settings on this deck can be changed to apply the appropriate recording characteristics, which make the recording sound better. Take this drawing, for example. Let's say that we're recording 2 tracks of stereo audio, and that this is the tape we're going to record it onto. The sound wave is coming into the deck and needs to be magnetically imprinted onto the tape. This wave cannot be imprinted accurately without bias, which is an additional high-frequency wave that helps magnetize the tape. Remember, the tape is made up of a lot of little metal particles, and won't necessarily magnetize evenly because while the particles are small, they're not uniform. The bias wave is added to the record signal to help saturate the tape properly, magnetically speaking, so the recording is more accurate. Next we come to equalization, which is a topic that I have read a lot about, and I'm 98% sure I understand what's going on, so bear with me here. The objective when you're recording to tape is to capture the full frequency range of human hearing, 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. Now, from what I understand of this, equalization actually has 2 components to it, which are the de-emphasis curve on the playback side and a slight treble boost for the record side. Equalization, like bias, is also to do with the magnetization of the tape, and how that magnetic field will eventually be reproduced as voltage, and thus an audio signal. See, the tape is traveling at a constant speed, whether it be 3 3/4 inches per second or 7.5 inches per second, and as the tape is being recorded, the rate of particles being magnetized is proportional to the audio signal coming into the deck. Anywhere between 20 Hz on the low end and 20,000 Hz on the high end is magnetically imprinted pretty much on the fly. When the tape is being played back, the magnetization on the tape is responsible for inducing an electrical signal in the playhead. Since the tape travels at a constant speed, the fluctuation in sound waves that have been recorded will mean a fluctuation in voltage being applied to the playhead, where bass waves produce less voltage because they have less frequency over time, and treble waves produce more. What we end up with is a playback signal from the tape that looks like this. That is a lot of treble and no bass. So, the basic idea for this graph is that when the tape is being played back, the voltage induced at the head will double with every octave of sound, because the same rate of change applies to the frequency of the magnetic particles on the tape. Double the magnetic frequency, double the voltage. So the de-emphasis curve is applied on playback, which is an exact reversal of this. The two curves end up canceling each other out through a series of capacitors and resistors on the playback side of the deck, which restores the flat frequency response and allows for an accurate reproduction of the audio signal. Now, you might have also noticed that there's a little bit of roll-off happening on this graph, and full disclosure, this graph is actually supposed to represent cassettes. But the logic is the same for reel-to-reel. Anyway, so the roll-off is a natural leveling off of the higher frequencies of the signal being recorded to the tape, because the tape can't store the same amount of high-frequency magnetic information as the treble rises towards 20,000 Hertz. So a lot of factors come into play for this. The speed of the tape, for instance. Slower tape can't hold as much magnetic frequency in the same space over time. Head gap sizes in the play and record head, where if the play head has too large of a gap, it won't be able to pick up past a certain level of magnetic frequency. And tape formulations as well, where newer and darker formulations are better at holding high frequency energy. So the same roll-off is compensated for in the playback de-emphasis curve, where the standardization committee for that curve figured that the higher frequency signals would end up being attenuated if the roll-off didn't end up being accounted for. Now, the second part of EQ is directly related to that. Compensating for the roll-off does help some, but not enough. So there is also, on the record side of things, a slight treble boost. So this part is not standardized and is left up to the manufacturer to decide, mainly because of all of the elements I described earlier. Head gap size, tape speed, etc. Essentially, because there's such a variety of different kinds and qualities of parts and components, it was left up to the manufacturer's discretion how best to set the recording treble EQ boost to best achieve a flat frequency response, like this graph shows. So this helps make recordings compatible across different tape decks, which was just as much the point as making good recordings. So now that we know the major goings-on inside of the deck and how it all ties together, the most that you as the user will really have to worry about is that each of the two settings for bias and equalization depend on the kind of tape that you're using. Standard tape, which is the lighter brown one, has an earlier start to that roll-off point than low-noise high-output tape does, so the equalization needs to start at a different point on the audio spectrum, which is controlled by that switch. Bias also has two different high-frequency waves that are used to imprint magnetic flux more accurately, and the bias switch controls that. I had wondered why there were two independent switches for control of bias and EQ like this. I mean, surely if one setting applies to one kind of tape and the other setting applies to the other, then they'd be one switch, right? Well, over the years, there were a few changes to the formulations of the tape, and I have a feeling that most of the boxes of reels that I've come across aren't really marked the same way cassettes are. I mean, cassettes have pretty straightforward bias and EQ settings, but Open Reel doesn't because, well, I think the definitive rules for this just were kind of hard to put on the box. All of the recordable tapes that I own have different marketing terms for standard type tape and low noise high output type tape. Great job with these ones, by the way, Radio Shack. But nowhere on any of the boxes is there anything really concrete saying use these settings, and the only ones that really claim to have any kind of professional knowledge about it are this tape and that tape, and let me show you some of these. So this is the back of the TDK Super Dynamic tape, and this has some hints on it, so let's take a look and see what we have. If your machine is equipped with a variable bias setting, you should set the bias peak at 400 Hz. This will result in maximum output from the SD tape. You may record at higher input levels with SD tape than with the tape you have been using. A 3 decibel higher input level will result in higher output from the tape with no increase in distortion, and upon playback correspondingly, lower apparent noise level. Well, it's things like that. I mean, that's a lot to digest all at once. Let's take a look inside and see if we can find anything else. Oh, there's more else, alright, but this is all pretty much just the same kind of typical jargon from the back. I mean, things like this. High output Super Dynamic tape offers as much as 5 decibels higher. Output at short wavelengths than conventional tapes. Low magnetic print through. Gone are the annoying echoes often heard before and after heavily recorded passages on conventional magnetic recording tapes. None of that really says use these settings, and I think that the information on the box is definitely helpful, but it kind of raises more questions than answers, because if you were a new consumer at the time, like I was when I first started doing this, a lot of that jargon doesn't really mean anything until you can get your hands on a tape and a recorder. And in a lot of cases, I don't think most people would be willing to look past that either. Both the recorder and the tape itself expect that you know a lot about recording characteristics, about tape formulations, and I think part of the reason that the format suffered as a whole was because there wasn't a lot of easy marketing for it. I mean, that's all entirely speculation on my part, but I didn't really learn much from the boxes of these tapes other than, well, now I have to go pick up a couple of books. Even more frustrating though, I wasn't really able to find anything definitive in the RT707's user manual, which has this to say about it. Bias and EQ switch combinations with different makes of tape. Table 1 lists the standard combinations of the switches and tapes, although the two switches allow a total of 4 combinations. The table does not aim to give you absolute values. Feel free to press and release the monitor switch and compare the sound at tape with that at source. Set the switches so that the sound is to your liking. Before choosing the LH and STD options, read the tape's instructions for use. This loosely translates to Pioneer saying, damned if we know what formulation of tape you're recording with, use the deck and figure it out yourself! In any case, bias, EQ, and formulation are all factors in the difference between tapes that sound like this, and tapes that sound like this. Yeah, one is a marked improvement over the other. And that being said, I have here an unopened, unused tape to record onto, and I think I know the perfect music to put on it. Reel-to-reel played a big part in a lot of 80s synth and new wave bands because these kinds of tape recorders were the only way to get studio quality close to the home. So a guy or two in a room with a synthesizer and a tape machine were the basic blueprint for a lot of bands when those technologies merged. And it's a shame that reel-to-reel as a home listening format fell out of favor before these bands were around. So reel-to-reel was always an expensive and niche market anyway, but it would have been awesome to have an album of the Human League or something on reel-to-reel, since open reel tape had almost as big a part to play as the synthesizer did in their music. So why don't I? Let's set up the tape machine. Here's the tape itself, and the first thing that we need to do is get this set up onto the supply reel here. A nice thing that I didn't know about tape that hasn't been recorded on yet, it actually comes with its own kind of stopper so it doesn't come unspooled over the years. So let's see if we can get this off of here. Awesome. Oh boy. Well, it left a little bit of a residue, but I'll work around it. So, onto the supply reel the tape goes. And this can be a little bit tricky every once in a while because it's just kind of hard to tell sometimes where the tape is in relation to the guide pins here. So, use the built-in clamp to hold it in place and thread the tape out a little bit. Here we go. Set the tape into the first guide over the roller here and bring it across the playheads, between the pinch roller and capstan here, and into the second roller until we... fuck's sake. There's like a 5-to-1 ratio of times that I've played reel-to-reels that I forget entirely to put the take-up reel onto the deck. It's the same process as the other one, just use the clamp built into the machine to hold it in place. Double check your work because you forgot the important thing, and bring the tape over from the supply reel side of things over to the take-up reel like so. Something that I'm enormously grateful for specifically on this take-up reel is the massive hole in the side of it because it gives you just enough space to make threading the tape much easier. Roll the tape on for a couple of turns because it'll give you some leeway for getting tension onto the tape to take up slack on both sides of the machine. Wind it on for a couple of turns with play. And reset the counter to 0. My recording source is going to be my computer fed into my AV receiver here, which in turn is connected to the tape player. At the tape player, it's time to get the levels, so start by playing music from the source, in this case my computer. Set the deck's monitor mode to source and raise the levels up slowly. You're going to want to adjust the deck against the loudest parts of the song in order to have the needle right about here at 0 between the red and black. The goal is to saturate the tape, but not to go over or under. Too much volume will make it sound too distorted, but too little will make the tape noise too apparent. And one other thing on the source itself, if you're recording an album, use the loudest song as your reference and set the deck against that volume level. If you're recording single songs like I'm about to do, this will have to be set every single time since different songs have different master volume levels. Awesome, so we have our levels, and next we have to get the tape ready to roll. Set the monitor mode back to tape, and in this case I'm going to be recording at 7.5 inches per second because quality over quantity. Besides, on this tape, 7.5 inches per second is 45 minutes of tape, so make sure the speed is set to that there. 19 centimeters is 7.5 inches per second, so I'm good. So, next we have bias and EQ and a proper check of the levels. Technically, I'm sure these are supposed to be set to low-high for both bias and EQ, mainly because of the color of the tape and because of the box itself. I mean, it's got high output right on it. But I like to be thorough, and I want you guys to see how it'll work. So earlier, I wound the tape on a couple of turns and then set this to the 0 mark. So what I want to do now is get the tape rolling a little bit. And I'm going to start a test recording at this point. To set the deck in record mode, make the left and right channels active up here. Bias and EQ are currently set to standard mode, so let's start the recording and monitor the changes. Press pause to start the deck in record pause mode, and then press record and play at the same time. Start the deck rolling, and hit play over at the source. Let's see how we did. Okay, so I think I have a good feel for the recording levels. The bias and EQ are all set to what I think sounds the best, which, interestingly enough in this case, is standard. And now, it's time to record. Now, you might have noticed earlier that these recorders are sometimes cumbersome as hell to thread, and each machine does it a little differently. So part of what I like about the RT707 is that it makes this experience much better. On a typical tape machine, you'd have to change the side of the tape pretty much the same way that I had to when I was recording the tape because most machines only work in one direction. The 707 has a direction change button, so you can play the tape in reverse without having to flip it, but it also has an auto-reverse function. This is what's called a foil splice. It's an aluminum tape that's meant to be conductive. On the tape player itself, there's a sensor here at the beginning of the tape guide. This sensor has an electrical current running through it. If we wind the tape onto the end and make sure we're at a point completely past any recording on both side A and side B, we can take the reels off and add a little bit of this aluminum tape to the mix. Now, while I'm doing this, there are two things that I'd like to note about it. In the first case, the foil splice itself has to be on the right side of the tape or it won't trip the mechanism properly. And in the second case, this would be a lot easier to do if I'd have thought ahead and bought a splicing block. I just don't have one of those right now, so this is probably going to be a little bit fiddly. Alright, perfect. So when the tape starts playing and comes up to the splice, it should trip the mechanism and start playing backwards by itself. This deck also has an auto-repeat function. This relies on both the auto-reverse splice being in place and the counter here set to 0. If we start the tape running, it'll keep going until the auto-reverse mechanism is tripped, and then when the counter reaches 99.99, there's another sensor inside of the deck that can tell when the counter hits that specific mark. When that time is reached, it'll play forwards again. That is so awesome! I mean, it's probably not something I'm ever going to use, but think about that. I mean, the amount of engineering that went into figuring out how to make auto-reverse and auto-repeat a reality on this tape deck is incredible. I really like this tape deck and the format that it plays. I mean, there's something really special about using reel-to-reel that gives me a sort of childlike fascination about hi-fi. I love messing around with equipment and figuring out how it all works, and I love the music that it plays, and if you're watching this, I hope you get the same enjoyment out of it that I do. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you like this video, you know what to do.